Wow, that's
Yeah.
staggering.
That's what I thought. I couldn't believe it. I mean,
Yeah.
this paper, I spent a lot of time reading it thinking, but I must have missed something. That can't possibly be like this. But it turns out it was.
You're listening to In Bed with Science, a sex podcast. I'm Lee Noren, a sex therapist with a Master of Science in Sexology and over 12 years of coaching, counseling, and therapy experience. Today, I'm talking to researcher Dr. Glen Spielmans about Bremelanotide, a medication approved to treat low sexual desire in premenopausal women, and what happens when we actually look under the hood of the research behind it. We get into how the drug is supposed to work in the brain, why its effects may be less impressive than they found, and how small changes to study outcomes can dramatically shift what gets approved. We also talk about how hard it is to measure something as complex as sexual desire, and why that matters more than you might think. But first, do you have a sex or relationship question you want to ask, but you're not quite sure where to turn? Now's your chance. I'm looking for thoughtful, personal questions about things like intimacy, mismatched libidos, emotional disconnect, and struggles with sexual pleasure and desire. Specifically, those messy, non-Hollywood experiences that we all have but rarely talk about. And I'll be answering them in upcoming episodes of the podcast with both compassion and scientific insight. Submit your story or question anonymously, or with your name if you'd like, and it might be featured in a future episode. Now, let's dig in. So today's episode is a bit of a departure from previous episodes because we're going to be talking about an FDA-approved drug called Bremelanotide. So we're going to be getting just a little more sciencey, to say the least, than usual. And this isn't my area of expertise. I'm not a doctor. However, I do specialize in low desire, so I felt this was very apt for the podcast. Now, before we dig in, I want to share what the proposed idea behind Bremelanotide's mechanism for increasing desire is. So basically, how it's meant to work. Now, the main idea is that it goes after a specific setup in your brain called the melanocortin system. And it zeroes in on particular spots like the melanocortin 3 and 4 receptors, which scientists believe play a role in sexual desire. And when it nudges these receptors, the goal is for it to boost the release of dopamine, so that kind of feel-good brain chemical, in key areas that affect sexual interest and getting aroused. So the main idea is that it works right in your brain. However, we're going to be getting into the fact that it does also affect your blood pressure and heart rate and stuff like that in the interview with Glen. Now, the medication itself isn't a pill, it's an injection. And it's one that has to be administered about 45 minutes before sexual activity. But here's the kicker. Here's what we're really going to dig into. Because the big question isn't really how it's supposed to work, it's whether it actually delivers on that promise. And here's where it gets pretty murky. Glen Spielmans is a professor of psychology at Metropolitan State University in Minnesota, USA. His research centers on critical evaluation of psychological and psychiatric interventions, and he's closely examined clinical trials of antidepressants and antipsychotics, often finding modest benefits and significant risks. And just FYI, Dr. Spielmans was recording in a cafe, so you may hear some noise in the background. Dr. Glen Spielmans, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I would love to start by hearing a bit about what drew you to this area of research on Bremelanotide and analyzing the trials that made the medication FDA approved.
Sure. It's kind of a random story. I was teaching a class in which we were talking about various mental health and other such conditions, and HSDD, hypoactive sexual desire disorder, was one such item that came up. I had a student who mentioned that, to her surprise, she was getting a bunch of ads in her social media, and she thought that was very strange because she had never done any searching that would have led her to be taken down that path. So she thought that was kind of strange, and that cued my interest. I had heard about Bremelanotide when it was first approved, and I had read a little that it, didn't seem to be tremendously effective. And then I just, kind of moved on with other things. And once the student mentioned that, I looked up the study in which the main trial results were published. It was at Kingsburg et al. 2019. And I looked at that and I thought, this seems off. I should really look into this more. And I ended up doing that. So basically, it was kind of a random student comment in class that led me down the road.
Yeah, okay. And with bremelanotide, could you please speak to how it's meant to work? Like, what's the idea behind it?
So it's supposed to work on cortin 4 receptors, which then is supposed to stimulate other areas of the brain that then lead to increased sexual desire. And to me, I would find like the mechanism more worthy of investigation if the drug worked really well. I feel like, sometimes people put a lot of emphasis on the mechanism, and I'm like, well, that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. Let's figure out if this thing works first before we, get really fiddly about whether the mechanism really makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. So that kind of leads me into what were the key findings of your study? Does it really work?
A lot of it comes down to what do you mean by work, right? And I think that's actually what I ended up really looking at was what does this all mean anyway? So first of all, there's sort of a two-part thing. So I published, there was a paper in 2021 that I was sole author on, and that was published in the Journal of Sex Research. And then there was a follow-up that myself and a student researcher named Elaine Ellefson did, and that was published in the same journal in 2023. So it's kind of a two-part. And, the first thing that I did is I looked at the main study that published the results of the 2 phase 3 trials, the so-called Reconnect trials that compared bremelanotide to placebo, both large studies. I compared those results to the Food and Drug Administration new drug application. So, basically what's been found over the past few decades is that sometimes journal articles will overstate how well a treatment works. And a lot of times it's hard to know, well, is the journal article being fully accurate or not? And one way to look at that is compare to what the FDA has on file, because the FDA is, a little bit more of an objective third party in terms of its analyses and its reporting of data, right? So compared that, and then also looked at there's a website called clinicaltrials.gov, and that website is where many studies, not all, will list their protocol where they say, here's what we're going to do. And that way you can look at a published paper and you can then go back to the protocol and go, well, did the researchers do the data analysis the way they said they were going to? Did they report data on the outcomes they said they were going to use, or did they fiddle around with things afterwards? So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's kind of what we did. We also looked at whether they reported data in the journal according to the kind of standard, what's called the consort data reporting standards. Basically, did they report the data in kind of the industry standard way, which they said they did, and it turns out they didn't. So they left a lot of things out. So kind of dug in there and basically found that, first of all, one of the primary outcome measures changed after the study was done, which I thought was kind of wild. So they started off with something called satisfying sexual events being one of 2 what they called co-primary outcome measures, right? So the other one was the SFI, the Female Sexual Function Index Desire Scale, which has only 2 items on it, which is something I'll get into later. They didn't really assess this very, I'd say, complex construct of sexual desire very thoroughly, right? So anyway, so they had the FSFID, and then they had satisfying sexual events as the second co-primary outcome. After the study was done, they changed the primary outcome, which you're not supposed to do. That's the reason you declare this beforehand. You say, here's what we think is most important, and then you're held to that, right? But they met with the FDA, and they argued that they should be able to change and get rid of satisfying sexual events, upon which the treatment basically didn't do anything on that particular outcome. So the FDA agreed to let them switch to something called FSDS-DAO number 13. Now, how's that? That's a mouthful, right? Which is basically a 1 rating scale item that measures distress associated with sexual desire problems. So they swapped, that became a primary outcome, and satisfying sexual events was then moved to a secondary outcome. So they got to decide what was the most important outcome after the study was done, all the data were collected, which is just wild. And so that way they were able to say, well, now we have statistically significant results on both of our primary outcomes. They weren't large results, they weren't medium results, they'd fall into what statisticians would call small treatment effects. And in a moment, we'll talk a little bit about what does that even mean, which I think is, an important thing to think about, because statistically significant results don't necessarily mean the results were important.
Right. Okay. Because in research, we talk about statistically significant findings and everything's kind of built around that. And now you're saying that doesn't necessarily have to mean anything important?
Yeah. Part of it, I think, is just the phrase statistically significant lends itself to being misinterpreted just because of the words that are used, right? Because most people, they hear statistical and they go, well, I don't know exactly what that means, but it sounds like math, right? I mean, statistics sound like math. All right. And then significant, well, people think important. Most people are thinking statistically significant. Oh, that means like math important. That means like it's a big deal. That's not what it means. So I don't know. I don't want to get super technical, but I'll talk about what statistically significant means, and hopefully it makes sense, kind of in layperson's terms. So basically, this is all based on something called null hypothesis significance testing, which, is also a mouthful and sounds kind of boring. And it sort of is, but it's important in this context because basically, let's say you do a study, right? And then you have to interpret the results. And let's say that your drug beats a placebo by 1 point on some rating scale. Well, then you want to be able to interpret, what does that mean? Anytime you do a study and you have the results, the null hypothesis says those results are just chance alone. They're just random numerical fluctuation. Don't make anything of them, right? That's the null hypothesis. Now, you can test the null hypothesis. This is what statistical significance means, is we test the null hypothesis. We basically go, what are the odds that the null hypothesis explains the results that we got in the study? So if there's a 1 point difference or a 2 point difference or whatever results you obtain, well, does the null hypothesis seem likely to explain that result? And if the answer is no, it seems pretty unlikely to explain that result, we really do think there's a difference here. That's all statistical significance means. It doesn't mean it's important. It doesn't mean it's big. It just means that we think that there's something going on here. That's it.
Right. And in the study, am I correct in understanding there was like a 0.6 statistic significant number that they kind of threw around?
Well, there's a few different things. So I'm talking about so far, like how much change on the average, change on a rating scale, right? You can also take things and you can kind of slice them and dice them into categories. So you can determine if somebody is a treatment responder. And if somebody improved, I think it was on the FSFID, if they improved by 0.6, which basically is one rating scale point. So that was determined to be a treatment responder, which is itself super arbitrary and not recommended. Because if you think about, if you know about sexual desire, it's not like it's not like there's an off and on switch where you go, oh, yep, you have it or you don't, right? So, most of these things, related categories, they're not categories. You don't put, it doesn't make sense to say somebody is a yes or a no, right? So they did, as part of their analysis, come up with determining whether somebody was a treatment responder. And according to Kingsberg et al. In the paper that was sponsored by the manufacturer, yes, there was more people were treatment responders. But according to the FDA's definition of treatment response, on one of these outcomes, you would have to treat 13 people with bremelanotide to get one additional treatment response. That's not very good, right? You would hope that, usually you'd be open to maybe treat 4 or 5 people to get an additional response, or, even less, but 13 to get an additional treatment response on the FSFID. On that other measure, the measure that has to do with distress related to low sexual desire, that was not even statistically significant, according to the FDA's cutoff point. So if you put it into categories, which I don't recommend doing, but if you do it that way, the drug doesn't really look good.
Yeah, it doesn't make me want to take it, listening to you describing it.
To me also, I think, the fact that it's like you give yourself an injection 45 minutes or more prior to sexual activity, like that to me seems like a weird setup for a lot of people. I'm sure for some people that might fit into their flow, but especially for folks who are struggling with desire problems, be like, oh man, I got to go run and inject myself. But I might have an injection site reaction. I might get nauseous. A lot of people got nausea on the drug. There's a lot kind of going against you there, I think.
Yeah, definitely adds a lot of pressure. Speaking of those side effects, you pointed that out in the main study that a lot of people stopped taking bremelanotide because of those side effects, and that they dropped out, a lot of them. Do you know how large that percentage was of the people who dropped out?
Yeah, total was about 18% of people dropped out due to adverse events, and then the total dropout rate was 42% of people that dropped out altogether.
So
And I mean,
18% was from the side effect and 42% just in general?
right, which was over twice as many people as those on placebo. So it was definitely people were not digging the drug, which is not, I mean, if you have a drug that's really effective and tolerable, you wouldn't expect twice as many people to drop out on the drug compared to placebo. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And did I understand you correctly as well that this wasn't mentioned in the main study, the fact that there was such a big dropout rate?
So the adverse events, so like who dropped out due to side effects, they listed the total number only in an appendix. So you'd have to take the time to pull up an appendix. And the worst part, they didn't break down how many dropped out on side effects on placebo versus drug. There was just this overall number, right? So you wouldn't be able to know that in fact it was you were about 10 times as likely to drop out due to side effects on the drug compared to placebo, which is a pretty darn big percentage. That was not reported.
Wow. That's staggering.
That's what I thought. I couldn't believe it. I mean, this paper, I spent a lot of time reading it thinking, but I must have missed something. That can't possibly be like this. But it turns out it was.
Wow. So bringing it back to what you were saying when they went to the FDA and had this discussion of changing those outcome measures, those kind of primary ones, do you have any idea why the FDA would allow them to change that, given that it kind of raises all of these red flags about the integrity of the finding?
Yeah. Good question. So I will say, first of all, just that the FDA, it's not the first time they've done this. I've looked at other trials, particularly in the areas of psychiatric medications, and the FDA, unfortunately, this is not the first or last time. I'm afraid that that's happened. But in this particular instance, there was some consternation about how good are these measures and what are we measuring? And, there is some question, and I think it's legitimate. Like, it's satisfying sexual events, like really a great measure, a primary outcome for low sexual desire. So basically, when a sexual event occurred, people were supposed to fill out something called the Female Sexual Encounter Profile Revised. One of the questions on there, the last one was, did you consider the sexual encounter satisfactory for you? Yes or no? That's it. Which, I feel like breaking that down into a yes or no is also a little weird. So, I mean, I can understand, like, methodologically why that's maybe not the best measure. On the other hand, they did agree to use it at the start of the study, right? So it's like, they don't agree to use a measure if you don't intend on using it. So, I've kind of got mixed feelings about it. I think it's probably not a super good measure. There have been other arguments in the literature saying that that's not maybe a good measure. And I'm willing to accept that there may be some problems with it. But at the same time, this was what they said they were going to use, and maybe you should be held accountable for it. And also, in the paper that reported the results, they did not say that they switched the outcome measures. That little detail wasn't mentioned. I feel like you should have, at the very least, if you're going to switch outcomes, primary outcomes, you should be reporting front and center so that everybody knows and can, make their own evaluation of what that means.
Yeah, because it just makes everything feel very fishy.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And I was also thinking, as you were talking, I wonder what kind of outcome measures would be good because desire is so complex.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that was kind of the second study that myself and Elaine did. We were looking at the measures that were done. And, I came in this as somewhat of an outsider, like, I'm not a sex therapist. This has not been like an area of interest I've, delved into a lot. And so I thought, okay, there must be some good reasons here that I'm not seeing, right? So I wanted to go, okay, maybe there's these measures that at face value, they don't look so good. But maybe there's some good evidence behind them. Yeah, no, there's just not. I mean, we plumbed the literature for, these measures that they used, that they reported outcomes on. Are these good measures of sexual desire? Is there good evidence to support that this is really getting at the construct that they're, supposedly getting at? And overall, I would say not really. I mean, so like the primary outcome that didn't change, the FSFID, it consists of a total of 2 rating scale questions, which is just mind-boggling to me. I mean, sexual desire is so complex, and to boil it down to the following 2 questions, I mean, heck, I'll just tell you what the 2 questions are. So,
please.
So first of all, these are the first set of instructions people are given, and notice how several things are kind of put together. It says, sexual desire or interest is a feeling that includes wanting to have a sexual experience, feeling receptive to a partner's sexual initiation, and thinking or fantasizing about having sex. So it takes all those things and pushes them together when there are 3 separate items, which is something you probably shouldn't do, nonetheless. And then it says, over the past 4 weeks. So first of all, it's requiring people to be mindful of their sexual desire over a 4-week time period, which I think they're going to have some problems with recall there. But anyway, the question is, over the past 4 weeks, how often did you feel sexual desire or interest? First item, almost always or always. That's considered to be the best outcome, is that somebody is just, full of desire all the time, which I'm not sure conceptually makes a hell of a lot of sense.
Yeah, what does that even mean? What would that look like?
Exactly. I mean, because I would imagine if that's true for someone, life doesn't usually provide those opportunities. Like, you probably got a job, you've got things to do. Like, I feel like that's going to get in the way. So that's strange to me that is, the first thing that's listed as that's the best outcome. The next choice is most times / more than half the time. Well, I mean, if you look at research that is asked, representative samples of women, how often do you experience sexual desire? More than half the time is a very rarely endorsed thing. Most women and most men, most people are not running around with, intense sexual desire more than half the time, which is probably good. I mean, we'd have to really restructure the world if that's what was going on, right? That would be pretty weird. So the next item is sometimes / about half the time. And again, even about half the time, feel that doesn't really correspond with like most people's rated levels of desire. So the first 3 items are not super aligned to reality. Then you have a few times / less than half the time, which is a little weird. A few times and less than half the time don't really align with each other. Like 49% of the time is less than half the time, which to me is actually quite a lot. I mean, I feel like if somebody had active sexual desire going on 49% of their waking hours, that's actually pretty high. So
Yeah.
These are just weirdly written items. And then the last item is almost never or never. So it's like, these are strange. Where does someone score themselves on here? Like in a way that makes sense. The rating scale anchors just don't make a lot of sense. Like a few times / less than half the time, those two things don't even really go together for most people.
Exactly. And also, I think those kind of questions would increase the distress that you feel about your desire, because it almost makes you feel like it should be at least 49% of the time, right?
That's right. I mean, yeah, you're looking at this, you're like almost always or always no. Most times, oh, no. About half the time, no. And you're like, oh my God, well, I've already gone through most of the items, right? So yeah, it is a strange setup. It's a very strange setup. And it also doesn't talk about the context, which I think is, a big omission, right? Because free-floating sexual desire isn't necessarily the problem. I mean, so the Bremelanotide studies were done on people in partnered relationships, right? So free-floating sexual desire isn't necessarily the problem. It's, do you have sexual desire, and, what's your sexual relationship like with your partner, I would assume would be, what we're really interested in, not like as you're at work at your desk, what's your level of sexual desire? Like that's not probably relevant, but that is it's just in general, what's your sexual desire, not in the context that matters the most.
So not between like solitary and dyadic desire.
Exactly,
not
that's not a
distinguishing the two.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the next question is, over the past 4 weeks, how would you rate your level or degree of sexual desire or interest? And this one isn't quite as bad, like very high, moderate, low. Like, okay, at least that makes sense. It's not quite as bizarre as the first item, but it's also, again, it's free-floating sexual desire. It's not, it doesn't specifically look at responsiveness to your partner versus initiation, which is something that this item has been criticized for. The scale in general has been criticized for. It's like, well, it just doesn't look at the context that matters.
Yeah.
So those 2 items, that's the primary outcome that didn't change. That's what they thought. That's the one. That's the outcome that really matters. And I think doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I was reading the paper, it said that even when women's scores of sexual desire went up slightly on paper, so for example, 35% of those who met the improvement threshold, they still said that they felt no real benefit from the medication. How do we understand this discrepancy?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. And it just gets down to, how we define improvement might not be very good. So first of all, level of improvement it didn't require much. Like you had to improve by, a point. So that's not a lot of improvement. But then on this rating scale, what does that 1 point improvement even mean? And maybe the people filling up the scale may not have even known either. You have these very inexact measurements with the FSFID. That first item, which is half of the 2 items, is, very hard to score oneself to understand it. So anyway, you have confusing measures that don't make a lot of sense in terms of even, if the rating scale points aren't clear, like what does improvement on that mean? Second of all, let's say that somebody, hypothetically, their sexual desire is improved. Well, someone's going to balance out perhaps with the side effects, right? Like if they're experiencing nausea, if they have an injection site reaction, well, maybe for them, that's not worth the trade-off, right? So like, yes, my sexual desire is a little more, but on the other hand, I'm really annoyed by these like adverse effects. So no, I'm not improved overall. And on the other hand, I think a third possibility is somebody could be, mildly improved, but it's only in one narrow area. Like maybe my free-floating sense of sexual desire is somewhat higher. On the other hand, my relationship isn't improved. Perhaps there's a mismatch in terms of like, sexual activity preferences between myself and my partner. That hasn't improved. There's other relational problems that haven't improved. My stress from work and parenting, that hasn't improved. I have one area of my life that's a little bit improved, but does that mean improvement overall? No, right? Depending on how somebody interprets it. So, right. And I think that's important to think about because oftentimes, we do these like little reading scales of one very targeted area, but overall, it's someone's life better. We can't assume it is. If someone's symptoms are a little bit better, that does not necessarily mean that their life overall has.
Yeah. Do you have any idea how commonly prescribed this medication is?
So I occasionally keep tabs. Like I would try to check in for the quarterly report. So the drug's had a long history. It's changed hands several times. It was FDA approved, which had a marketing agreement in the US. And then it's been sold again recently. Basically, a private firm took it over. So now there's a lot of information they don't have to provide because it's not a publicly traded company. So I tried to find out. I was interested, like how often is this drug being prescribed now? And on their website, they didn't provide much information about that, which I think if it was selling really well, they would probably, be bragging about it. It was being prescribed pretty infrequently. So it just did not seem like it was widely successful. And I'm not sure, like in Sweden where you're at, is it approved there?
I don't think it's approved in Europe either, in general. So a lot of my clients are in the US. I haven't heard many who've found success with it or who know about it or who have tried it either. So it doesn't seem like it kind of did as well as they were hoping it would do.
Yeah, it's not done nearly as well. And I think part of it was the first drug in the category, I think helped set the market and how it's going to do. Like when Prozac hit the market, for instance, for depression, that did so well in terms of prescription that really opened the door for other drugs to really move in and there was just a big enough market for depression to really, have Zoloft and Paxil and other drugs really take off. Whereas flibanserin hasn't exactly been flying off the shelves either, right? That was the first drug to be approved for HSDD. So that didn't take off. And as a result, that just didn't create a lot of excitement in the market for here's a disorder we've really got to treat, and these are great treatments. That did not happen. And in the context of, the firm that put out Palatin/AMAG, they're pretty small firms. They're, they don't have a lot of experience, doing big product launches, nationally and such. So I don't know the inner workings of the firms, but I know they're just not very large. And I know that, Palatin was actively looking to offload the drug for quite some time. So it felt like they weren't really looking to do it themselves. That wasn't their thing. They're more of a drug development firm. And by the way, their stock is doing quite terribly. Palatin's not doing well. Yeah. So they've got their own problems. They were delisted from the New York Stock Exchange for a while. I don't know if they got back on. They were trying to, but they're not doing great. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Bringing it back to what you said, you mentioned, Prozac for depression, and that did so well. I wonder why that kind of drug has been easier to develop or has sort of a more significant impact on people's lives than something that has to do with desire. Because in my mind, depression is also complicated. It's not like it's a simple switch either.
Right. First of all, there's just a gigantic target audience. The diagnostic criteria for depression only require you to have symptoms for 2 weeks or more, which is a very long time. If you have a bad couple of weeks, then, who doesn't, right? It's pretty easy to walk into those diagnostic criteria. So the other thing with Prozac is its advantage that some of the older antidepressant drugs came with a fair number of side effects, and B, could be toxic and overdose. Like people can die from overdosing on antidepressants. When you think about it, it's pretty bad. If someone's really depressed and they're suicidal and you give them drugs they can like die by suicide on, that's a problem, right? So Prozac, the reason Prozac was really successful was that they were able to, Eli Lilly, the sponsor of Prozac, was able to get primary care physicians on board prescribing it. That was the key, was to take it from this is a psychiatrist thing to any old doctor or nurse practitioner can prescribe this. So that was their thing. Basically marketing it as it's really safe. It has very few side effects. Turns out that's not necessarily true. And I mean, you've worked with people with sexual desire problems, and SSRIs are often part of the issue, right? So So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of marketing that probably went well beyond, the science. But certainly, the other thing is in terms of the healthcare system, like right as Prozac was hitting the market, that's when more healthcare was being shifted to primary care physicians in the United States. More the managed care approach of the primary care physician is the gatekeeper. You need to start with them. And Eli Lilly smartly saw that and said, great, and that's who we're going to target. We're not going to, sure, we'll market psychiatrists, but we're going to really, unleash the hounds to get the drug marketed in primary care. And that's where psychiatric drugs in general have taken off. That's where we have antipsychotic drugs being widely prescribed by primary care physicians now to treat things like depression. So, yeah, the landscape has changed a lot.
Yeah, definitely. You were saying something at the beginning of our conversation about, when they changed the outcome measures and the FDA kind of approved that, you said something to the effect of and that's not the first time the FDA has allowed that kind to happen. Why does that keep on happening?
It's a really good question. I mean, it's a good question. This is about 10, it would have been about 12 years ago. I did a real deep dive into the FDA drug approval process because I had looked at several new drug applications and looked at well, wait a minute. I mean, this is what they said they were going to do, and then they changed it, and the FDA said, yeah, no, that's fine. You can do that. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem right. I mean, according to, the law is somewhat vague in that it says there has to be evidence of efficacy from multiple studies. And that has always been interpreted as multiple being 2 randomized controlled trials. And what they don't say is what effective really means, but it's been taken to mean that you have to be statistically significantly better than a placebo on your primary outcome measure. And on occasion, the sponsor has gone back and said, oh man, we picked a really bad outcome measure. We're really sorry about that. But there's this really better measure, which by sheer coincidence, our drug did better on. And we really think that would be a more appropriate thing to use. And the FDA has been, in some cases, receptive to those arguments. Now, you can only see one side of the ledger because the FDA only publishes new drug applications that are approved. So if a sponsor tried it and the FDA said, no way, you can't do that, I wouldn't know. They don't publish that information. So I can't, I'm not going to say the FDA always gives into those things, but certainly sometimes they do. There's a really lengthy report done by a couple journalists, Lenzer and Brownlee, recently, in the last couple of weeks, about the FDA, very deep dive about how the FDA often approves drugs with very minimal evidence of efficacy. Cancer being a big one, so for instance, it might show that, there's some tumor growth seems slowed, but we have no idea if it keeps people alive longer, makes them overall healthier. We have no idea, but the drug gets approved anyway. So, I mean, it's not just this area, unfortunately. This is not a one-off occurrence.
Wow. That's fascinating and a bit terrifying.
Yeah,
well.
I mean, I will say one thing I'm thankful for is that the FDA does a pretty good job of publishing their drug reviews online, which a lot of regulatory agencies don't do. You can go back and dig through them and compare them to, like I did, compared to the journal articles that supposedly, report the results. And it's not the most efficient way, and I'd rather have the FDA maybe stick by their rules. Maybe that would be nice, but at least, people who are interested can spend the time wading through and, seeing if there was anything that doesn't add up, right? So I give the FDA credit for at least doing that. They don't always do it. They don't always publish every review they're supposed to, but most of the time they do follow through with that. That allows researchers to be able to go back and check things, which is nice.
Right. And going back to your study, is your study in any way controversial, or are these kinds of studies continuously done on FDA approved drugs?
I mean, it's controversial in the sense that Kingsburg et al. Didn't really like it. So we had they had this little exchange where they submitted a letter where they said that I did a very bad job, and I don't know, I found their arguments pretty lame. They said that I didn't have their deep clinical expertise. I was like, that's not relevant. I mean, true, but I don't see how that's relevant to evaluating this drug, So anyway, I don't want to sound like sour grapes. People argue, that's okay. But I feel like it would have been more controversial if the drug was more popular. And you know what I mean? For instance, there was, regarding antidepressants, Eric Turner and Irving Kirsch are two researchers who have compared FDA results to published studies and found, decent sized discrepancies between the two. And those things got a lot of press, which, makes a lot of sense. And they were considered controversial because there's millions upon millions of people taking antidepressants, whereas Bremelanotide, there's just not that many people. So it's a very small, shallow pond I'm fishing in, I guess.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Okay, so given all of this, given everything we've talked about, how do we make sense of the fact that it's been FDA approved, despite that there are very small effects and they're kind of questionable?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the size of the effect, statistically. It's, the arguments that sometimes are made in return is like, well, yeah, but they're about the same effect size as antidepressants for depression, which I would say, which are considered to be pretty small too. So that's not I wouldn't necessarily want to ride that horse to victory. But I think the other thing is these are different measures, right? So, and I feel like with these sexual desire drugs, the outcomes are just so fuzzy and nonsensical. Literally they're between the FSFID2 or desire, which has two items that we talked about, and then the other outcome was satisfying sexual events, which, as we talked about, was one question. It's like there's three questions, and then when they swapped that out because it didn't give the results they wanted, then they asked, that was substituted with one rating scale question asking them about their distress due to sexual desire. That's so non-comprehensive. At least the depression studies, they're using rating scales that have got, depending on the study, 10, 17 items, which and there's been a lot of consternation in the psychiatry literature recently about how good are these measures? And I would say that, I agree. I think these depression measures are questionable themselves, but they sure look good compared to these sexual desire measures, which I think are just not very good at assessing sexual desire. I'm not the only person that thinks this. I mean, in the sexual desire literature, I found that, there are other folks who had looked at these measures and thought, yeah, these are not great. But at this point, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of effort. And there's some people have pieced together other measures, but there haven't been a lot of studies to validate them. But I would suspect that there were resources allocated to using some of these other measures. Perhaps they'd find that some of them, would validate better than the current measures that I looked at.
Yeah. Low desire is obviously an individual and a relationship problem. It's not like a problem for society at large. But it feels like we're looking for an individualized, really simple solution when there are so many factors at play, even systemic factors, like worrying about your income or there are so many other pieces. And it almost feels like a sign of the times as well. Like social media reduces everything to like this easily digestible bite of something. We're just not allowing for the human complexity of everything.
Right. Entirely.
Yeah.
And I understand, they have to, you have to use a rating scale so that you can figure out if something works enough to get a drug approved. Like, I understand that that's how the system is set up. But at least use a better rating scale,
Yeah.
I understand as a clinician, I cannot imagine there is a clinician in the world who would sit down with the FSFID to assess how well treatment is working. I cannot imagine there's a clinician who does that. If they are, I'd like to ask them what they're thinking. I'd be really curious because these are just...
Yeah. If you had to choose 1, 2, 3 main takeaways from your paper, what would you say they are?
Yeah, good question. If the outcomes themselves are questionable, then, the results become kind of uninterpretable. So there's that. But if, somebody were to somehow accept these as valid measures, then the effects are quite small. I mean, this may be too technical, but the 2019 paper that published the results of the clinical clinical trials did so much slicing and dicing of data that was not according to the study protocol, which to me comes across as just slicing and dicing the data to make it, as sometimes people say, torturing the data until it tells you what you want to hear. So they take these, rating scale items. If you scored above, if you improved by 0.5 on this, you're a responder. If there's another thing you scored above 0.6 on, you're a responder. It's just seeming, and there's no published literature on doing these, right? Like, is there
so random cutoffs, kind of?
It seems random or carefully chosen to support how well to make the drug look effective is what that would be my guess, right? I mean, I don't have any particular insight into that outside of that. It doesn't make sense to look at these as yes or no measures. They're not used as yes or no measures typically, and the study, most importantly, the study protocol did not say that's how they were going to analyze the data. So when suddenly there's, I think it was 15 measures that appeared in the Kingsburg et al. Paper that were not in the study protocol, I find that a little fishy. Right? Like, why are we suddenly doing these measures that were not in your study protocol and magically all of them tilt in your direction? That seems a little suspicious to me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. How can people listening stay up to date with your research? I know it's not all about sexual desire or sexual dysfunction, but I think what you do sounds really fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you. This is sort of the thing that I've done a few times. I'm really interested in how well treatment works. And I'm maybe a little cynical in that I think sometimes we oversell things. What does that actually mean? Let's not oversell things. And if something does work, that's fantastic. Let's not, sell it short. I don't have one that's set up independently. So one could just look on the Google Scholar, go to scholar.google.com, type in the name of any researcher you're interested in, and you can kind of see what they've done.
Thank you. I mentioned in the interview that I think the introduction of this medication in some ways is a sign of our times, where we're really often trying to reduce something complex, like sexual desire, into a simple biological mechanism. Kind of the way that social media makes really complicated phenomena and diagnoses such as ADHD or depression or burnout or even trauma kind of seem simple and like it can be fixed quickly. That maybe you only need a supplement or this kind of 5-minute hack and everything will be resolved. And I think it makes a lot of sense that we do this and a lot of sense that it's appealing to us for multiple reasons. One of them being we live in an increasingly demanding world where that village that we once surrounded ourselves with is becoming eradicated or even is eradicated to some extent. Meaning we're kind of piling on more and more responsibility on individuals than we've ever done before, right? We all should have full-time jobs or we're the sole caregivers for our children, right? We perhaps don't have grandparents or aunts and uncles or even friends and extended family to help us. And we're simultaneously expected to meet crazy deadlines and respond to emails at all hours of the day. We all have way too much to do and too little time to do it. And it seems like these pressures on our daily lives just keep increasing. So while technology has solved a lot of issues, right? There's no question about that. I think it's also created a lot of them because most of us are expected to be joined at the hip with our phones and be responsive all of the time to this kind of constant inundation of pings and notifications. And with all of these increasing demands, there's increased overwhelm. Our nervous systems can't handle all the things that they're being dealt. And when we're overwhelmed, we actively seek out the simple stuff, the stuff that our brains can understand easily, and the stuff that soothes us too, like hearing that something is simple and there's a quick hack to fix it even when it might not be. And so these quick fix solutions are the ones that become most appealing. And it's the same for me. I think it's the same for everyone. With overwhelm, we can't take in that complexity. Therapy or coaching isn't nearly as appealing as being able to take a pill, right? Let's be honest. Taking a pill doesn't really require effort, but therapy or coaching very much does. The other reason I think we gravitate toward a solution like a pill is that we've all been taught that desire is simply a biological function, much like hunger or thirst. But this isn't true, right? So we know now that only one part of desire is biological, and the rest of it is created and influenced by psychological, relationship, and even cultural factors. So psychological factors are things like work and stress about sex, but also just general life stress, a lack of self-confidence, shame. Relationship factors that can impact desire are things like emotional distance or conflict with your partner, or deep-seated resentment about things like emotional labor or taking care of the house and feeling like your partner isn't stepping up to the plate. There are also cultural factors, like ideas about how desire should work in long-term relationships if you're with the right person, or even growing up in a home where sex was taboo. And just like Glen Spielmans said in the interview, desire isn't just a switch that we can turn on or off. So, put really simply, it's not as easy and straightforward as we've been led to believe. Therefore, solutions often aren't as easy and straightforward as we've been led to believe. Sure, there are simple things like, trying out a new sex position or buying a sex toy or exploring a fantasy. And these are things that we know work, right? Science has proved that this works. And if you want a deep dive on that, go back and listen to episode number 4 on what keeps passion alive in long-term relationships. It's really fascinating. But the thing about these simple hacks and these simple tips or, increasing novelty is that it only works up to a point. If there are other things that are in the mix, like resentment or stress or feeling ashamed of your sexuality, feeling ashamed of your turn-ons, or feeling worry and anxiety about your desire levels not being where you think they should be, something like novelty often isn't going to hack it. And this, I think, just shows how complex desire is. Because a pill can't reduce your insecurity in bed. A pill can't remove that emotional disconnect and make you all of a sudden feel closer to your partner. So is it any wonder that a drug that was created to solve something so complicated like desire doesn't seem to be that effective? Because I don't think it is. But the good news is that low desire isn't something you have to accept if it's distressing to you. So there are lots of ways to get desire back and to increase it. And I know this because I specialize in low desire and I help my clients do this every day. And I know this because I've experienced these difficulties too, right? I'm not just helping my clients with it, I've helped myself with it. So if you take away anything from today's episode, let it be this. Sexual desire is complicated, and therefore solutions often need to be multifaceted. Targeting one factor or targeting one area, like your biology, often isn't enough. Not saying it's never enough, but often it isn't enough. And there are lots of things you can do to regain your desire. But it starts by focusing on what the actual issue at hand is. Why do you have low desire? Because when you focus on the why, it will point you to what you need to work on. And if you would like my help doing that, I have a free resource called the Desire Test that you can find on my website. The link is in the show notes. And if you want help from a sex therapist and coach who is specialized in low and mismatched libidos, working on regaining your desire without pressure and stress, because there's no point stressing yourself out about it, right? My one-to-one online program, Redesire, is open for enrollment. So check that out via the link in the show notes. That's it for In Bed with Science. Please remember that everything shared in this episode is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice or therapy. For personal support, please reach out to a qualified professional. Thanks for listening.